at Ground Zero in downtown New York to mark the somber 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on America. The first couple were accompanied by former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and the former First Ladies Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton, who joined families of victims and survivors who paid tribute to the almost 3,000 people who perished on that day in a traditional reading of their names.
The Star-Spangled Banner filled the memorial site, now a 2-decade-old tradition where the families of victims and the survivors from that fateful day are placed front and center. Moments of silence capturing the exact time the towers were hit and fell. The President delivering a message from the White House overnight.
Whether it's the first year or the 20th, children have grown up without parents, and parents have suffered without children. Husbands and wives have had to find ways forward without their partners in their life with them. Brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts, loved ones and friends have had to celebrate birthdays and milestones with a hole in their heart. No matter how much time has passed, these commemorations bring everything painfully back, as if you just got the news a few seconds ago.
An American flag unfurled on the west side of the Pentagon at dawn to remember the over 120 people who perished when a third plane smashed into the headquarters of America's Defense Department, while a third memorial will be held later in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where a fourth commercial jetliner was brought down by brave passengers before it could reach the nation's capital.
The days that followed September 11, 2001, we saw heroism everywhere, in places expected and unexpected. We also saw something all too rare, a true sense of national unity. Unity and resilience, the capacity to recover and repair in the face of trauma. Unity and service, the 9/11 generation stepping up to serve and protect in the face of terror, to get those terrorists who were responsible, to show everyone seeking to do harm to America that we will hunt you down and we will make you pay. And that will never stop, today, tomorrow, ever, from protecting America.
And while almost 3,000 people perished, over 6,000 were injured, and many survived, including this man who was buried in the basement of the South Tower of the World Trade Center when it collapsed on top of him.
I couldn't even see my hands. My eyes were open. Going through my mind was, it got really dark, it got really quiet, that I'm dead. And then the second feeling was, wow, it wasn't that bad. I didn't feel anything. But at that point, now I'm like, it's 2001 New York City. How is this stuff happening? And my son is turning 3. There's a birthday party next month. My wife is pregnant. Like, what? Your brain, so many things go through it. I'm sure other things went through that I just don't remember. And I started to taste grit in my teeth. And I started to smell smoke. And I said, okay, I'm alive.
A day that forever changed America. Now a time of remembrance for so many who will never forget. And a new generation that will only learn about these attacks and its aftermath in museums and history books. Sherwin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Well, to help us look at the events of that fateful day and the legacy that followed the 9/11 attacks, we're now joined by Antonio Aiello. He's a writer, editor and storyteller. And for many years, he was content and editorial director for PEN America, where he developed written and multimedia content and the intersection of free expression advocacy and as well as the literary arts to give voice to issues of social justice and writers in peril around the world. While at PEN, he worked on Guantanamo-related projects like Reckoning with Torture and the Torture Report. Well, more recently, he has partnered with Mansour Aryafi, a former Guantanamo prisoner, on his Aryafi's memoir, Don't Forget Us Here, Lost and Found at Guantanamo, published by Hachette August on August 17, 2021, and graphic narratives for the book Guantanamo Voices. He and Aryafi are Sunday's Fellows and episodic TV to develop their dramatic hashtag limited series from Guantanamo with Love. He joins us now from New York City. Antonio, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to The Globe.
Thanks for having me.
Just bring us up to speed and paint us a picture of, if you can, where you were when the 9/11 attacks unfolded. And did you perhaps anticipate at that time how it was going to impact your life later on?
Not at all. So I was actually in Brooklyn at the time. I heard the first airplane hit, and I actually watched the two towers burn and fall from the roof of my apartment in Brooklyn. I had friends and family who perished that day, and for the days and weeks and months afterward, we lived under the cloud of 9/11, and also felt what it was like to have the fear and rage and sorrow that came along with the downing of the Twin Towers. I guess what I didn't expect to happen were the wars that would take place afterward, and the war on terror that has taken the last 20 years, and also many of the other victims that have taken that we don't necessarily think about when we think about 9/11. The men who were rounded up in Afghanistan and Pakistan and sent to Guantanamo, and who were rendered to black sites around the world and tortured. The victims of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so I think, for me, 9/11 has many different meanings, and I have a lot of different mixed feelings about it. But, now today I'm thinking a lot about the remnants of 9/11 and what's left after it, which are a lot of devastation and a lot of wars that the United States carried out in its name.
You say that 9/11 has got different meanings. What are those meanings? What does it mean to not just American people, but to the broader global community?
Right. Well, I think, for Americans and especially New Yorkers, 9/11 is still a day of remembrance and loss. That will always be a part of our lives. I think for the people who experienced 9/11 and the after effects of it, think of it very differently, and they think of it as a time that started this war on terror. And for example, Mansour Adayfi, who I helped write his memoir about his 14 years at Guantanamo. To him, he was an innocent man who was swept up when he was 18 years old and tortured and sent to Guantanamo, where he was accused of being an Al-Qaeda fighter, which he wasn't. He was held for 14 years. He was harassed and tortured and had many unspeakable things done to him. He was there for 8 years without legal representation. So I think, for some of the other people who were also victims of 9/11, I think they see it as something much different, where the war on terror began and a lot of innocent people were swept up in America's rage.
Now, Antonio, just take us through your experience of working with, the former Guantanamo Bay prison detainees.
So, I've worked very closely with Mansour Adayfi over the last 3 years. And, before I started working with Mansour Adayfi, I'd worked with PEN America on projects like Reckoning with Torture and the Torture Report, which used original documentation to show what the United States had done to 780 men held at Guantanamo and who were rendered around the world. But with Mansour Adayfi, he wrote extensively while he was at Guantanamo. He was taken there when he was 18 years old. He came of age at Guantanamo. So half of his life was spent in a secret detention facility where he was away from his friends and family, where he was in isolation cells and solitary confinement, where he was, interrogated endlessly and experienced outrageous treatment and torture. So, Mansour and I have developed an incredible relationship where we've really worked hard to bring not just his story out, but the story of the 780 other men who were held at Guantanamo, and really what the United States has done to them and continues to do. Guantanamo is still open. There are still 39 men who are held there, while 10 to 12 of them are suspected to be charged with some sort of crimes. There are many other men who are still there who have never been charged with a crime, and we don't know when and if they'll ever be charged and if they'll ever be released.
But how long were you detained for, and were you ever charged for any offense?
So Mansour was never charged with a crime. He was interrogated. He was believed to be a middle-aged Egyptian general. He was 18 years old when he was taken into custody. I think the United States at the time was not prepared with an interrogation process to gather information, and I think they made a lot of missteps. And I think a lot of the reason what they've done with holding these men indefinitely is to really, cover up and hide the fact that they just did some outrageous things to men who had no business whatsoever being detained, and certainly not being tortured. I think that goes without saying.
And how were the conditions at the prison?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. You broke up.
How were the conditions at the prison?
The conditions were terrible. There were several different phases at Guantanamo. There was the beginning 3 months at Camp X-Ray, where the men were basically put into the equivalent of dog cages, just chain link fencing. The next phase was at Camp Delta, where they lived in reconfigured shipping containers that were extremely hot. They were mostly in solitary confinement or isolated from each other. They were interrogated regularly. Their food was not up to par. Their conditions were terrible. They were also run through an interrogation program that functioned with sleep deprivation, mood alterations. They were experimented on. They had tremendous amounts of things done to them. And the final phase they were moved into maximum security prisons at Guantanamo, where they lived in complete isolation from each other. So the conditions were terrible, and I would say that they were probably against many international laws.
Yeah. Now, 20 years later, the United States has withdrawn its forces and its troops from Afghanistan, leading to the collapse of the government, leading to the loss of lives. What are your thoughts on this, Antonio?
It's a little bit heartbreaking to see the collapse of Afghanistan. When we look back at where the Taliban was in 2001 and where they are 20 years later to the day, the Taliban have more territory. They're in control of all of Afghanistan now. And, tens and thousands of lives have been lost. I think, it's hard to look back and say what we could have done differently. I would say that, not rendering people from Afghanistan, not starting, wars that really brought a lot of destruction was not the way to go. It's a little bit heartbreaking to see what was done in Afghanistan and Iraq in the name of 9/11, and especially to have Afghanistan fall the way it did so recently is a little bit heartbreaking.
Let's talk about Islamophobia and whether it's still, a real thing 20 years later after the 9/11 attacks.
I think Islamophobia is still a very real thing, and I think these are issues that the United States and Americans will be contending with for a long time, even as we commemorate or memorialize 9/11. There's still a lot of Islamophobia. There are still a lot of profiling of Muslims. We've made some steps, but I have to say that after 4 years of the previous administration, of the Trump administration, a lot of the anger and hate and Islamophobia and xenophobia was allowed to come to the surface and allowed to really perpetuate through the country. And I think it's much more emboldened than it was. I think in 2001, I think people were afraid in 2001, and now people are just flat out Islamophobic and racist.
But what causes it, though? I mean, what's the genesis of Islamophobia, as a result of this exaggerated fear, the hatred, the hostility towards Islam and Muslims that is perpetuated by what I'd call it negative stereotypes, resulting in bias and discrimination?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of just ignorance. I think what you find are that people just don't know a lot about Islam. And I think when they're not knowledgeable about something, it creates fear. And I think a lot of Americans' Islamophobia and racism stems from a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding of what those cultures really represent. I would imagine that most people who are Islamophobic just don't really know what Islam stands for. They certainly wouldn't have read the Quran, and they don't know the cultures. They don't know anything about the cultures where Muslims live. So I think it really stems from a lot of ignorance. And that's where I would say that's it.
Antonio Aiello, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Well, that was Guantanamo Bay detainee Antonio Aiello talking to us about his experience at Guantanamo Bay prison, and is just sharing his thoughts and his reflections on the legacy that followed the 9/11 attacks in New York and as well as Pennsylvania, where 3,000 Americans lost their lives 20 years ago on this day.